Hello marine biology students. In this video, we're going to be learning about some of the challenges to living in a marine environment. This week, we're going to be talking about challenges to life in the oceans, reproduction of marine organisms, and an introduction to the diversity of marine life. The oceans include many habitats. Each with their own challenges and concerns. So habitats are areas where an organism lives. Now, marine organisms will fall into different groups based on where in the habitat they live and also how they move. Planktonic organisms. Are those that drift in the water. They're subject to currents. They are not strong swimmers. They may have some mild swimming ability, but a current will carry them where it's going. So planktonic organisms, they are in the water column and they are not strong swimmers. Conversely, benthic organisms live at the bottom. And they may have varying degrees of swimming ability, to being entirely sessile and not able to swim at all, to otherwise just fish that tend to spend most of their time on the bottom itself, and also other marine invertebrates. And then the last group are the nekton. These are the fast, active swimmers. So these are the three major categories of marine organisms. Again, the planktonic organisms who just sort of float, the benthic organisms who are down at the bottom, and then the nekton who are the fast, active swimmers. They can resist currents or even break free of currents when needed. Now, regardless of which category an organism finds itself in, one factor that impacts all of the marine organisms is water-solute balance. All organisms need to be able to have the essential components of life within the cytoplasm of their cells. Whether it's the macromolecules they need, the energy-making molecules, even their enzymes, they need to be present there. But there also needs to be mechanisms for cells to regulate the amount of water and solutes within their cells. The plasma membrane, which is a boundary around the cell, is mostly permeable to water, but impermeable to ionic and organic solutes. Yet still, water balance becomes an issue because water is going to attempt to move to equalize concentration gradients across that plasma membrane. Diffusion is the property of liquids that causes molecules to move from where they're in a high concentration towards where they're in a low concentration. This is a property that occurs in all liquids and gases due to the movement of their molecules. Now, there's a specific category of diffusion known as osmosis. Osmosis is the diffusion of the solvent, or the main dissolving liquid of a solution. In the vast majority of cases, this is going to be water. And it's usually the movement of water from an area in where the water is more concentrated to an area where there is a lower concentration of water. A solution that's more concentrated with solutes than with water. Water is going to attempt to move towards that solution. So when we think of water as a solute, a variety of different types of substances will dissolve into that water. And as those molecules dissolve, they will try to distribute themselves evenly. This is the result of diffusion. Diffusion is always working towards equilibrium. Since marine organisms live in a very solute-rich environment, they have a tendency to gain solutes and lose water. This can result in the death of the cells if the water loss or solute gain is significant. So organisms living in a marine environment needs to find ways to deal with this solute-rich environment. We'll talk about some specific mechanisms that organisms have as we start discussing the diversity of life in the next few weeks. Now, a few terms that are important for us to understand as we're discussing osmosis and diffusion are the terms we use to compare solution concentrations between two different solutions. The first term that I'd like to introduce you to is hypertonic. The prefix hyper means above or more than, and in this case tonic or tonicity is referring to molecules dissolved in a solution, or the solute concentration. So a hypertonic solution has a higher solute concentration when compared to another solution. The opposite, a hypotonic solution, is going to have a lower concentration of solutes compared to another solution. And so in fact, by definition, since we only use these terms in comparison, if one solution is hypertonic, that means the solution you're comparing it to is hypotonic to that first one. Then lastly, if you have two solutions that have the same ion concentration or the same solute concentration, we would say that those two solutions are isotonic. And that prefix iso just means the same. Now it turns out you can have two isotonic solutions that have very different solutes in them, but that ratio of solute concentration to solvent concentration would be consistent, and so we would still say those two solutions are isotonic with each other. Again, these terms, even isotonic, cannot be used when talking about a single solution. We can only use these terms when we're comparing solutions. Now, sometimes when we're using these terms to describe an environment, like a hypertonic environment, the other solution that's being compared is the cytoplasm. Within the organism cells. So if the environment is hypertonic, that means the cytoplasm is hypotonic. Now, why do we care about the concentration of solutions? Well, it has to do with that property of osmosis. If you recall, water is going to try to equalize concentration differences. Water can move through the cell membrane, even if the solutes cannot. And so, if an organism is in a hypotonic solution, meaning the solution outside of the cell is less concentrated, water is actually going to start flowing into that cell. In fact, enough water could flow into that cell that the cell could rupture or lyse. This would be the case of taking an organism that is adapted to living in a marine environment and putting it in a freshwater setting. Whether you caught a saltwater fish on your last vacation and plan to bring it home to your freshwater fish tank, that's not going to work out well for that organism. A marine adapted organism usually has a high concentration of solutes in its cytoplasm. If you put it in a freshwater environment, the water will rush into those cells will swell up, rupture, and burst. Conversely, if you decide you want to take your pet goldfish to a vacation down to the beach, and you take this freshwater fish and put it in a marine setting, well, that poor goldfish is going to shrivel. The water is going to leave the cells of the goldfish, attempting to dilute the ocean, and your goldfish is going to lose that battle. It will take a lot more water to dilute the ocean than is found in your goldfish, and it will shrivel and shrink and die. Organisms are happiest when their environment matches, at least to some degree, the concentration in their cytoplasm. But what we'll see is that some organisms do have the ability to live in an environment slightly different than their own cytoplasm and still manage to survive. But it does take special mechanisms to do that. Now, why is it that water flows towards a hypertonic solution? The concentration of a solution tells you about the ratio between the amount of solute, or the dissolved components, and the amount of solvent, or the dissolving components. So, the ratio between solute and solvent. A hypertonic solution has a higher ratio of solute to solvent compared to another solution. This also means that it has a lower solvent concentration compared to that other solution. So there are more salts, or there are more dissolved materials, but there's actually a lower concentration of water in a hypertonic solution. Now, since osmosis is a form of diffusion, diffusion always wants molecules to move from where they're at a high concentration towards where they're at a low concentration. So with osmosis, the water will move from where you have a lot of water, or a high concentration of water, a very dilute solution, towards a more concentrated solution, towards the solution that doesn't have a lot of water in it, or has a higher concentration of solutes. So in that way, water will move from the hypotonic solution into the hypertonic one. Another way to think about this is that water is always trying to dilute the more concentrated solution. Because diffusion is always working towards equilibrium. Diffusion is trying to make things equal. Now it comes to different organisms. Organisms need to maintain somewhat stable internal conditions. We call this concept homeostasis. Now, how does this work? Well, some organisms will try to match whatever the ionic solution of their environment is. We call these organisms osmoconformers. So for osmoconformers, their internal concentration varies as the salinity in the water around them changes. They match their environment. They do not attempt to control solute and water balance. That means that these organisms, their cytoplasm concentration will match their environment. These organisms can only tolerate very narrow ranges of salinities. Many marine invertebrates fall into this category. Luckily, the open ocean and many marine environments have very stable salinity levels. Another strategy is to be actively different than your environment. These organisms are known as osmoregulators. Because they regulate their water and solute balance. These are organisms that control their internal concentrations of solutes in water. This is true of most marine vertebrates, and also most freshwater aquatic vertebrates as well. Now, this can be done in a variety of ways, like secreting very little urine, or using specialized glands to secrete salts. In fact, as we'll see, sharks and even some of the giant squid, they use a different metabolic product called urea to fill the cytoplasm of their cells so that it matches the surrounding salinity of the seawater, yet they are in active control of those solute levels. Osmoregulators can generally tolerate a wider range of salinity than osmoconformers, yet usually there are limits for these osmoregulators as to the concentrations of environments that they can live in. But we see some amazing examples of fish, such as salmon, that start their life entirely in freshwater, in rivers and streams, and yet they live most of their adult life in the oceans, a salty environment, and then they return back to a freshwater environment to spawn and eventually die. When looking at saltwater balance in fish, we'll see different mechanisms for a marine fish compared to a freshwater fish, because these organisms are dealing with slightly different environments, even though their internal cytoplasm may be very similar to each other at about 14 PSU, or about 14 parts per thousand salinity, compared to the ocean at 35, or compared to freshwater, which is at 0. These fish need to have mechanisms to balance their water and solute level within their body. Again, for a marine fish, it will be drinking a lot of seawater, yet a lot of the salt in that seawater will pass through its gut. It won't be absorbed and it will be excreted. Usually there's very small amounts but highly concentrated urine. Also, salt can be secreted by the gills. Conversely, looking at a freshwater fish, they don't drink the water. They end up absorbing water through osmosis. They are able to retain salt through their gills, and they usually produce large amounts of very dilute urine without a lot of salts, because they need to retain as much salt as they can, so it's not lost to their environment. Another aspect of homeostasis is temperature control, and you may be familiar with the major categories of ectotherms versus endotherms. Ectotherms generate body heat metabolically, but that heat is lost rapidly to the environment. So those organisms cannot maintain a constant internal body temperature. Their body temperature is simply going to match their surrounding environment. And these are organisms we would refer to as cold-blooded. So ectotherms, ecto means outside or external, so they get most of their body heat from outside of their own body. Conversely, endotherms retain most metabolic heat. Their body temperature is generally higher than that of the surrounding environment. Now, another category beyond just ectotherm versus endotherms are poikilotherms versus homeotherms. So a poikilotherm is going to be an organism whose body varies with the temperature of their surrounding environment. And this might sound very similar to ectotherms versus endotherms, which we just talked about, but as we're going to see, there are actually some categories of endotherms who are also poikilotherms. Conversely, homeotherms these are going to be organisms that their body temperature does not change with their environment. So humans, and in fact all mammals and birds, we are endotherms and we are homeotherms. But when we look at this chart looking at marine organisms, there are poikilotherms that are ectotherms, and these are most marine invertebrates, even most fish and marine reptiles. But there are some larger fish, such as sharks and tunas, and even some billfish like marlins, that are technically endotherms. They generate body heat, their body is warmed, and they are warmer than their surrounding environment, but they are poikilotherms, meaning that if they're in a cold environment, they'll be slightly warmer than it, but they'll still be cooler, compared to birds and mammals who, almost regardless of the temperature of their surroundings, their internal body heat is set by their own mechanisms. So that takes us to the end of this video. Now, before our next video, I want you to ponder the question of how reproduction counteracts death. All right, see you in the next video.